Karen smashes restaurant table with chair after cold soup complaint. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The evening was moving along smoothly in the upscale downtown bistro. The soft hum of conversations and the clink of silverware against delicate china filled the air as patrons enjoyed their evening meals. The lighting was dim, set to create a cozy, intimate ambience, with a hint of elegance that suggested this was a place where expectations were high and service was paramount. Waiters and waitresses moved quickly and quietly through the narrow aisles between tables, their crisp uniforms a sharp contrast to the warm wood and luxurious decor that filled the room. At the far end of the dining area, a couple of tables were occupied by regulars, and the rest of the space was filled with guests enjoying their meals with an air of quiet satisfaction. For the restaurant, it was just another typical night of well-prepared food and well-mannered guests. That is, until Karen arrived. She entered the bistro with an air of expectation, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor as she strode confidently toward her table. The hostess, a young woman dressed in the restaurant's signature black attire, greeted her with a warm smile, but Karen's expression remained stern, as though the very act of entering the establishment required a level of service that exceeded the usual hospitality. She glanced around the room, making a mental note of every detail, how clean the floors were, how immaculate the presentation of each dish seemed, how attentive the waitstaff appeared to be. Nothing escaped her scrutiny, and it was clear that she considered herself someone who had earned the privilege of enjoying the best that dining had to offer. Karen was seated at a table near the window, where the city lights cast a golden glow across the street. She didn't bother with small talk, merely scanning the menu with a brisk hand before making her choice. It was clear she had dined here before, as she immediately ordered a chilled gazpacho to start, followed by the entree she had already decided on. She was a woman of decision, her expectations set high and her mind closed to alternatives. As she waited for her first course, her eyes scanned the room, evaluating everything around her, each moment ticking away in her mind as part of the carefully crafted dining experience she expected. When the waiter finally arrived with her chilled gazpacho, he placed the bowl gently in front of her. The smooth red liquid looked refreshing, with a few crisp vegetable garnishes scattered across the top. Karen's gaze flickered over it for a moment before she stared back at the waiter, her brow furrowing ever so slightly. The waiter, who had been trained to be attentive yet unobtrusive, smiled warmly, ready to move on to the next table, but Karen's voice, sharp and demanding, cut through the quiet of the restaurant. "This is far too cold," she stated flatly, as if the very idea of having to explain her complaint were beneath her. Her voice was not raised, but it had a biting edge that left no room for disagreement. "I asked for it to be at room temperature. This is practically frozen." Her words hung in the air, heavy with authority, as though the kitchen should have read her mind and prepared the dish according to her unspoken preferences. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, looking at the waiter as though he had committed some grave offense by failing to meet her expectations. The waiter, startled by the sudden shift in tone, nodded quickly, trying to regain his composure. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice apologetic. "I'll have the kitchen reheated for you right away." Karen waved her hand dismissively, as if even the act of reheating the soup were an inconvenience to her. "No, no," she snapped, her tone almost impatient. "I want it reheated. You'll do that for me, won't you? I'm not eating something this cold." The waiter's heart sank. It wasn't the first time a customer had sent a dish back, but Karen's reaction was disproportionate to the issue at hand. Gazpacho, being a cold soup, was part of the restaurant's carefully curated menu, served as it was meant to be, chilled. Yet, in Karen's eyes, this small detail didn't matter. What mattered was her comfort, her preferences, and the assumption that the restaurant staff should bend to meet her demands, no matter how unreasonable. Still, the waiter knew he had to resolve this, so he nodded again, giving a tight smile, and backed away from the table. The kitchen staff, used to accommodating various requests, was quick to react. They understood that customer satisfaction was paramount, even when the complaints were unreasonable, and the chef reluctantly agreed to reheat the gazpacho, knowing that this would not be a simple fix. The soup was designed to be served cold, and reheating it would change the delicate flavor and texture, but the customer was always right, or so they were taught. As the waiter returned to Karen's table with the now warm bowl of soup, his attempt at a friendly smile was met with Karen's scrutinizing gaze. She eyed the soup with the intensity of a hawk, as if searching for signs of imperfection. When the waiter set it down in front of her, she didn't even bother to thank him, instead picking up her spoon and stirring the soup as though she were inspecting a lab specimen. "This is better," she said, almost with a sense of finality. Her voice held an air of approval, but it wasn't enough to mask the annoyance still hanging in the air. She took a small spoonful, tasting it before setting the spoon down with a huff. "It's not quite perfect, but I'll manage." The waiter nodded, relieved that the situation seemed to be nearing its conclusion. He smiled and took a step back, but as he did so, he felt the sudden, sharp sound of a chair scraping across the floor. The noise was startling, and before he could even turn around, Karen had pushed herself up from her seat, standing abruptly and slamming her chair into the table with such force that it caused the delicate plates to rattle dangerously. The noise was deafening, and in the calm of the bistro, it felt like an explosion. The surrounding tables turned to look, the peaceful atmosphere of the restaurant shattered in an instant. Karen's face was a mask of fury as she pointed an accusing finger at the table, her voice rising in a scream. "I'm being poisoned," she shouted, the words spilling out with the kind of exaggerated emotion that only Karen seemed capable of. "This is disgusting. I asked for room temperature soup, and you bring me something that feels like it's been in the freezer. And now, I'm eating something that's been reheated? This is unacceptable." The waiter, now stunned and overwhelmed by the sudden escalation, froze in place. His hands trembled slightly as he looked around, trying to figure out how to calm the situation. The surrounding diners were all staring, some whispering, others wide-eyed, unsure of how to react. Karen, meanwhile, continued her tirade, her face red with fury. "How dare you serve me food like this? I've eaten here before, and I will never come back again. This is outrageous." She grabbed the chair again, lifting it over her head as though preparing to throw it. The sight of her lifting the chair above her head was enough to send a ripple of shock through the other diners. They were frozen, unsure of how to respond to the spectacle unfolding before them. Before the situation could escalate further, a manager rushed over, his face a picture of concern. Ma'am, please, calm down," he said, trying to approach her without agitating her further. His hands were raised in a placating gesture, though his mind was racing to find a way to diffuse the volatile situation. "Let's talk about this. There's no need for violence. We'll take care of your concerns right away. I promise you." Karen's eyes were wild with frustration, but as the manager spoke, her grip on the chair loosened. She set it down, but only after one last, seething glare at the waiter. She took a deep breath, trying to collect herself, but the words that came out were still filled with venom. "I'll make sure you all hear about this. I know people who can shut this place down," she threatened, her voice trembling with anger. The manager, now facing the full force of Karen's wrath, smiled tightly. "I'm very sorry for your experience, ma'am. We'll do whatever we can to make it right. Let's take care of the check, and we can ensure you leave here feeling satisfied." He gestured toward the door, signaling for the waiter to prepare the bill, though it was clear that the damage had already been done. The restaurant's peaceful ambience had been shattered, and Karen's presence had left a lasting impact on both the staff and the other diners. As Karen was escorted out, still muttering under her breath about the poor service she had received, the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. The chairs were righted, the plates were picked up, and the murmurs of the patrons returned to their quieter conversations. The waiter exhaled in relief, his shoulders sagging as he let go of the breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The manager, though professional to the end, couldn't help but shake his head slightly. This, he thought, was just another night in the restaurant business. Another night where no matter how hard you tried, it seemed you could never please everyone. The tension in the upscale bistro was palpable, hanging in the air like a thick, uncomfortable fog. After Karen's dramatic outburst, the entire atmosphere had shifted. The once pleasant dinner service, the quiet hum of clinking silverware and murmured conversations, now felt strained, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next escalation. Karen's tantrum had not only disrupted her own dining experience but had cast a long shadow over the entire room. The restaurant, usually a sanctuary of fine dining and sophistication, had now become the setting for her personal performance, and she, the center of attention. Every glance from the other diners seemed to carry a mixture of disbelief and mild concern. The staff, no strangers to difficult customers, were doing their best to maintain composure, but the specter of Karen's outburst loomed large, her anger still radiating in waves, even as she was escorted away from her table. As Karen walked briskly toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, she could feel the eyes of the restaurant on her. She could feel the judgment, the disapproval, but she didn't care. To her, it wasn't about them, it was about what she deserved. She had asked for something simple, something she thought should be easily accommodated, and when the waiter had failed to meet her needs, when he had dared to bring her a chilled soup instead of something at room temperature, she had been left with no choice but to act. She wasn't going to let anyone push her around. She wasn't going to let some minor mistake ruin her evening, especially not when she knew she had the power to make them feel the consequences of their incompetence. As she pushed open the door to the bistro, the cool evening air hit her face, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel a sense of relief. The world outside was far less judgmental, or so she believed. She had made her point. She had asserted herself, and now, there was nothing more to be done except to wait for the inevitable apology. Behind her, the door swung shut with a soft chime, signaling her departure. Inside, the bistro slowly began to return to its previous rhythm, but the echoes of Karen's eruption lingered. The waiter, still standing near the table, ran a hand through his hair, visibly exhausted. He had dealt with difficult customers before, but Karen's explosive reaction was something else entirely. It had been an overreaction to something as trivial as a cold soup, yet the way she had handled it had made the entire situation feel much bigger than it was. He had tried his best to accommodate her, offering the only solution he could think of, reheating the soup, but it hadn't been enough. She had insisted that he had poisoned her, a word that still stuck in his mind like a bitter taste. He had hoped that the gesture of taking the soup back to the kitchen would be enough, but Karen had refused to be satisfied, her demands becoming more extreme with each passing moment. The table, now cleared of all the shattered plates, bore the marks of the chaotic scene that had unfolded. He glanced at the remnants of the dinner service, feeling a mixture of disbelief and regret. This was supposed to be a simple evening, but it had turned into something far more dramatic than he could have ever anticipated. The manager, a seasoned professional with a calm demeanor, approached the waiter and placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a silent reassurance. He had witnessed the entire scene from a distance, and though he wasn't surprised by Karen's behavior, the sheer intensity of the outburst still left him unsettled. He had seen customers like Karen before, demanding, entitled, and unwilling to accept anything less than perfection. They were the ones who, despite being served an exceptional meal in an exquisite setting, would find some minute detail to pick apart, all for the sake of validation. The manager sighed quietly, his mind already racing through the necessary steps to smooth things over with the other diners and ensure that the evening continued without further incident. He turned to the waiter and spoke in a low, measured voice. "Don't worry about it. It's done now. We'll clean up and move on. Just make sure you take a moment to breathe, okay?" The waiter nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained. He wasn't used to being treated this way, and he certainly wasn't used to having the evening's peace so completely shattered by someone else's tantrum. It was one thing to encounter a demanding customer, but Karen's actions had crossed the line. He had spent years working in restaurants, learning how to handle everything from simple complaints to full-blown confrontations, but this was different. This wasn't just about food or service, it was about a person who felt entitled to impose their will on everyone around them, no matter the cost. The thought of Karen's angry tirade still rang in his ears, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. As the manager moved to speak with the other diners who had witnessed the spectacle, offering them free drinks or a discount as a gesture of goodwill, the staff began to work together to restore some semblance of normalcy to the bistro. The chairs were set upright, the broken plates cleared away, and the floor was quickly swept clean of the remnants of Karen's outburst. The tension in the room began to dissipate, but there was a lingering sense of unease that hung in the air. The diners, though trying to resume their meals and conversations, couldn't help but glance over at the empty table where Karen had sat, the remnants of her brief but explosive presence still fresh in their minds. At the bar, the bartender poured drinks for a group of regulars, offering them a comforting smile as he engaged in light banter to ease the atmosphere. He had witnessed more than his fair share of difficult customers over the years, but there was something particularly unsettling about Karen's behavior. She had entered the restaurant with an air of expectation, as though she were entitled to the best, but when things didn't go her way, she had flipped into an almost animalistic fury, as though the very idea of being inconvenienced was enough to trigger an outburst of violent emotion. The bartender couldn't help but shake his head in disbelief as he handed a cocktail to a customer. "Some people just can't handle a little imperfection," he muttered under his breath. As the night wore on, the bistro began to return to its normal pace, the earlier incident fading into the background as the staff continued with their work. The diners seemed to have mostly forgotten about Karen's eruption, though a few whispered among themselves, recounting the scene with the kind of gossip that was inevitable in a space like this. The evening continued, its rhythm returning as the final courses were served, glasses clinked, and conversations flowed more freely. But for those who had been witnesses to Karen's outburst, the night would never be quite the same. The restaurant, normally a place of quiet sophistication, had become the backdrop for an uncontrollable display of entitlement, one that would leave a lasting mark on everyone who had been present. Karen, meanwhile, was long gone, her memory of the evening likely fading into the cloud of grievances she carried with her wherever she went. She might have left the restaurant, but the aftermath of her actions lingered in the minds of everyone involved. For the staff, it was just another day of dealing with the unpredictable nature of customers, another evening that had taken an unexpected turn. For the other diners, it was just another story to tell when recounting the night out. But for Karen, it was yet another moment of perceived injustice in a world where nothing ever quite went her way. And as she drove away from the bistro, her thoughts already shifting to her next complaint, she allowed herself a small, self-satisfied smile, convinced that she had won. After all, she had made a scene, and that, in her mind, was victory enough. The atmosphere inside the upscale bistro had shifted dramatically in the wake of Karen's chaotic departure, and the once serene ambience now felt punctuated by an awkward silence that clung to the air like the aftermath of a storm. The staff had, with remarkable efficiency, cleaned up the mess left in Karen's wake. Plates had been cleared from the shattered table, the mop had swished across the floor to remove any remnants of spilled drinks or soup, and the chairs had been carefully aligned back into place. Yet, despite the swift work, the lingering tension was almost tangible. It wasn't the first time that the bistro had dealt with difficult customers, but this was something different, something more disruptive. Karen's outburst had broken the unspoken contract between customer and restaurant, a contract that implied both parties understood the rules of social decorum, respect, and patience. The janitor, who had witnessed the entire scene from the back hallway, couldn't help but shake his head as he leaned on his broom, still processing the spectacle he had just witnessed. He had seen a lot in his time working in the bistro, people arguing over the temperature of their steak, the wine selection not meeting their lofty standards, the occasional comment about the lighting being too dim or too bright, but nothing compared to the explosive energy that Karen had brought to the table, figuratively and literally. It was as though her rage had been bottled up for days, ready to erupt at the smallest trigger, and the failure of her gazpacho to meet her highly specific temperature expectations had been the match that set it all aflame. He thought of the moments that had preceded the eruption, her haughty gaze, the dismissive way she waved her hand as though her very presence should have been enough to change the temperature of the dish, the way she had accused the waiter of poisoning her with something as harmless as cold soup. But the most unforgettable part had been when she had grabbed the chair, raised it high above her head, and slammed it down on the table, sending shards of glass and porcelain flying into the air. It was a sight to behold, almost cinematic in its sheer absurdity. Back in the kitchen, the staff exchanged nervous glances, a mix of disbelief and exhaustion settling in as they moved through their final prep work for the evening. The chef, who had seen his share of chaos in his years of working in fine dining, was cleaning his station when one of the servers approached, visibly shaken. "You wouldn't believe what just happened," the server said in a low voice, still trying to come to terms with the chaos that had unfolded just a few minutes earlier. The chef raised an eyebrow, wiping his hands on a towel as he turned to face the server. "What's going on?" "Some woman went absolutely ballistic over the gazpacho," the server continued, clearly still rattled by the incident. "She was screaming about it being too cold, saying we poisoned her, then grabbed a chair and slammed it on the table. Plates everywhere. I swear, I thought she was going to throw the chair at someone." The chef let out a slow exhale, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've seen my share of tantrums over food," he said with a sigh, "but this is a new one. That's beyond absurd." He paused for a moment before continuing, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose I should be grateful it wasn't the lobster bisque. That one's a real crowd pleaser." Meanwhile, in the dining area, the manager was handling the aftermath with the professionalism that came with years of experience in high-end restaurants. He was used to handling complaints, especially those that escalated beyond the normal scope of customer dissatisfaction, but even he had to admit that Karen's outburst had left him stunned. The other diners, though still reeling from the shock, were starting to settle down, their conversations returning to a more normal volume as they tried to move past the disruption. The manager, who had just finished speaking with the building's security staff to ensure that Karen had left the premises without further incident, returned to his post near the door, watching the patrons as they continued their meals. He was well aware of how one difficult customer could affect the overall atmosphere of the evening, and he made it his mission to restore the vibe of the restaurant as best he could. With a polite but firm smile, he approached the closest table, where a couple of regulars were sitting, still processing the events they had just witnessed. "I hope the rest of your meal is to your liking," he said smoothly, offering them a glass of wine on the house as a gesture of goodwill. "I apologize for the interruption earlier. We take all customer concerns seriously, and will be addressing the situation promptly." The regulars, who had been caught between feeling uncomfortable and somewhat entertained by the spectacle, nodded politely, accepting the wine and offering their reassurances. "Oh, don't worry about it," the woman at the table said with a smile, though her eyes still carried a trace of curiosity. "It was a little shocking, but we understand these things happen. We're just glad it didn't escalate further. We've had some wild evenings here before." The manager chuckled lightly, grateful for the regulars' understanding. "I'm sure it was a memorable experience for everyone," he replied. "But we'll make sure it doesn't happen again." He gave a brief nod and walked away, his mind already shifting to the next task. The restaurant, despite the chaos, had to move forward. In the meantime, Karen's car sped down the street, the harsh clicking of her heels still echoing in her mind. She had exited the bistro as though she were leaving the scene of a battlefield, convinced that she had triumphed, that the damage she had done had been justified. Her mind raced with thoughts of what she would do next. She would make sure the restaurant heard from her, she would write a review, call corporate, make sure they understood the injustice that had been done to her. As she drove, the anger slowly began to cool, but it was replaced by a more calculating thought: she had made her mark. Her outburst had been a statement. It was unlikely that anyone would forget the scene she had caused, and that, to Karen, was the point. She wasn't just a customer, she was someone who demanded respect, who expected to be treated like she was above the ordinary rules that applied to everyone else. She arrived home and immediately went to her laptop, determined to draft the perfect review. Her fingers flew across the keys as she recounted the events in vivid detail, exaggerating the circumstances for maximum effect. She described the cold gazpacho in a way that made it seem as though it had been a direct insult, as though the restaurant had intentionally served her an underwhelming dish. She talked about the waiter's incompetence, the lack of empathy from the staff, and, of course, the chair incident, which she framed as the dramatic final straw. She finished the review with a flourish, certain that her words would carry weight, that the restaurant would have no choice but to respond with an apology. Karen clicked submit, satisfied with the review. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about asserting her power, about making sure that her voice was heard and that the restaurant would never forget who she was. And, in that moment, Karen allowed herself a small smile, knowing that she had won. In her mind, at least, she had. The morning after Karen's explosive departure from the bistro, she woke up feeling a strange sense of satisfaction, mixed with a twinge of anticipation. She had made her statement the night before, her outburst over something as trivial as a cold soup having escalated into an unforgettable scene. She could still hear the echoes of the chair slamming against the table, the shattering of porcelain, the gasps of the other diners, and the frantic energy that had swirled in the air before she stormed out, victorious in her own mind. The satisfaction of having taken control, of having raised her voice and made sure everyone knew she would not tolerate being treated like a mere customer, filled her with a sense of pride. She was a woman who knew what she deserved, and she was confident that the restaurant, now fully aware of her expectations, would make it right. After grabbing her phone, Karen immediately opened her email and checked the inbox. She had already drafted the perfect review in her head last night, detailing the poisonous soup, the waiter's incompetence, and, of course, the drama of the chair incident. She had laid it all out with the kind of precision only a person like her could manage, painting herself as the victim, the one who had been wronged in a world full of inconsiderate service. She felt confident that by now, the bistro would have seen her review and would be scrambling to respond with a public apology, one that would reassure her that they understood her outrage and that the matter was being handled with the seriousness it deserved. She smiled as she clicked on her review, which was still sitting in her sent box, waiting for the attention it so clearly deserved. But as her inbox refreshed, her smile faltered when she saw the lack of notifications. There were no emails from the restaurant. No messages from the manager. Nothing at all. Karen frowned and refreshed her email again, checking to see if something had been delayed. There was still nothing. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and for a brief moment, she felt a flicker of doubt. Was it possible that they hadn't read her review yet? Maybe they were preparing a carefully worded response, one that would be filled with the appropriate level of remorse for how she had been treated. She checked the restaurant's website. No response. She went back to the email and checked again, still no sign of the expected reply. Her mind raced. How could they not have reacted yet? Surely, they understood the gravity of the situation. Surely, they would have taken the time to apologize and offer some form of compensation for the humiliation she had endured. Karen, always the master of her own narrative, was starting to feel a wave of unease wash over her. She had expected a swift resolution, something that would reinforce her belief that she was in the right, that her anger had been justified, that she had been treated with disrespect by the staff and the establishment as a whole. And yet, the silence was deafening. There was no acknowledgement of her complaint, no formal apology, no word from the management. The knot of frustration tightened in her chest as she realized what was happening. The restaurant, the manager, and even the staff had probably already moved on from the event. They had likely forgotten about it entirely, considering it a minor inconvenience at best. To them, she was just another dissatisfied customer, another one of many who had come and gone through their doors. She was nothing more than an unpleasant memory, a brief disruption in their otherwise successful evening. The thought that they had dismissed her complaint so easily, that they hadn't been sufficiently shaken by her outburst, gnawed at her. She had expected a response, a tangible acknowledgement of her power, her influence. But all she had received was the cold, empty void of indifference. With a deep, frustrated sigh, Karen decided that she couldn't just sit there and let it go. She would not let herself be ignored. She wasn't the type of person who let things slide, especially when she knew she was in the right. She grabbed her phone again and scrolled through the restaurant's contact page, looking for any avenue through which she could make her voice heard. She didn't care if they had already seen her review. She would make them respond, make them understand that this wasn't just about cold soup, but about a lack of respect, a lack of consideration for someone who had paid for a fine dining experience and expected it to be perfect. She dialed the number for the restaurant, her pulse quickening with each ring, her irritation swelling as she imagined the excuses they would try to offer. When the receptionist answered, her voice warm and professional, Karen wasted no time. "I need to speak to the manager immediately," she demanded, her voice sharp and clipped. "It's urgent. It's about the incident last night." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before the receptionist responded, her tone still polite but now tinged with a hint of hesitation. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the manager is not available at the moment. Would you like to leave a message?" Karen's frustration bubbled up again, and she clenched her fists as she spoke. "No. I want to speak to someone who can actually address this. I had a terrible experience last night, and I expect a full explanation. The staff needs to understand that what happened was completely unacceptable." The receptionist, sensing the growing tension, tried again. "I can pass along your message to the manager, and they will get back to you as soon as possible. I assure you, ma'am, we take all complaints seriously." Karen's patience, already thin, snapped. "No. I don't want a message. I want a response right now. I want a resolution, not an apology that gets lost in the shuffle. Do you understand?" She had crossed the line from simple complaint to demand, and the receptionist, though still polite, was clearly struggling to maintain the conversation without escalating it further. There was another pause, and finally, the receptionist relented. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll send your complaint directly to the manager, and they'll contact you as soon as possible." Karen hung up the phone, her mind swirling with thoughts of what to do next. She had done everything she could. She had called, she had written the review, and she had made her case. It was only a matter of time before they contacted her. Surely, they would understand the importance of resolving this issue quickly. The silence from the restaurant had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, but she wasn't about to let it break her. She was confident that her actions had been justified. She had made sure everyone knew what had happened, and now it was only a matter of getting them to admit it, to apologize for their failure. She would not be forgotten. Her voice, her demands, would be heard. As the day wore on, Karen found herself checking her phone obsessively, waiting for the manager's call. Hours passed, but no response came. She couldn't shake the unease building in the pit of her stomach. The lack of acknowledgement was beginning to feel like a personal affront, like a dismissal of everything she had worked for, everything she had tried to achieve. The frustration reached a boiling point as she sat in silence, waiting for the phone to ring, but it never did. Finally, as the evening wore on and the sun set outside her window, Karen sat back in her chair, staring at her phone screen, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. It wasn't just about a cold soup anymore. It was about recognition, about respect, and about making sure her voice mattered. But as she sat there, the silence continued, echoing louder than any words ever could.